The Veltrathi Empire had ruled the stars for 12,000 years. They had conquered 900 worlds and destroyed anyone who stood against them. Their fleets were so large that no one could count all the ships. Their name alone made other species fall to their knees and beg for mercy. They had never lost a war. They had never failed to conquer a world. They believed they were the most powerful beings in the entire galaxy, and no one had ever proven them wrong. Ambassador Zythar was one of the most feared Veltrathi in the Empire. He was tall and covered in shining scales that changed color in the light. He had 6 eyes that could see in every direction at once, and sharp claws that had ended many lives. He had personally conquered 32 different species, and watched their worlds burn when they refused to submit. He enjoyed his work very much. On this particular day, Zythar sat in his command chair aboard his flagship, the Eternal Conquest. His fleet of 300 warships had just arrived near a small blue planet, orbiting a yellow star. The planet was called Earth by its inhabitants, a species that called themselves humans. Zythar had studied their radio signals for several years. He had watched their television shows and listened to their music. He had seen them fight wars against each other over small pieces of land. He thought they were weak and foolish and would be easy to conquer. His tactical officer, a younger Veltrathi named Korzan, finished scanning the planet and turned to face him. The humans had approximately 8 billion individuals living on their world. Their technology was primitive compared to the Veltrathi. They had only recently begun to explore their own solar system. They had nuclear weapons, but nothing that could threaten a Veltrathi warship. Korzan reported all of this with a bored tone in his voice. "This would be a simple conquest," he said. "Perhaps the easiest one yet." Zythar clicked his mandibles in agreement and ordered his communications officer to open a channel to the planet below. The standard submission protocol would be used. He would demand their surrender. They would cry and beg, and by the end of the day he would be enjoying a feast in their capital city. It was the same story every time. The view screen flickered, and a human face appeared. It belonged to a male with short brown hair and tired eyes. He wore a dark uniform with symbols that Zythar did not recognize. There was a white cup in his hand filled with some kind of brown liquid. His name tag said Captain Daniel Morrison, United Earth Defense Command. He looked at the Veltrathi ambassador with an expression that seemed more annoyed than frightened. Zythar began his speech. He announced himself as ambassador of the Eternal Dominion and informed the human that his planet now belonged to the Veltrathi Empire. All governments would surrender immediately. All resources would be transferred to Veltrathi control. All humans would be integrated into the Empire as servants. Resistance was not advised, because resistance was impossible. The Veltrathi had never been defeated, and they never would be. The human named Daniel stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he lifted his cup and took a slow drink of the brown liquid inside. When he lowered the cup, there was a strange smile on his face. It was not the smile of a frightened creature. It was something else entirely. Daniel told the ambassador that his demands would not be met. He said it simply and calmly, as if he was discussing the weather. Zythar felt his scales prickle with irritation. Perhaps this primitive creature did not understand the situation. He explained again that 300 warships were now orbiting their planet. He explained that Veltrathi weapons could turn their cities to ash in minutes. He explained that they had no choice but to submit. Daniel set his cup down on his console and leaned forward. His eyes were no longer tired. They were sharp and cold, like the edge of a blade. He told Zythar that he needed to understand something important about humans. He said that humanity had been fighting wars since before they learned to write words. They had spent their entire existence learning how to kill each other more efficiently. They invented weapons that could destroy entire cities in a single flash of light, and then decided those weapons were not destructive enough. They created poisons that could kill millions. They built machines designed to hunt and kill other machines. And all of that was just humans fighting against other humans. Daniel paused and his smile grew wider. He told Zythar that the Veltrathi had just given humanity something it had never truly had before. They had given humans a common enemy. They had united every nation on Earth against a single threat. They had made every human being on the planet agree on one thing for the first time in history. And that thing was that the Veltrathi needed to be destroyed. Daniel told the ambassador that he had made the worst mistake in the history of his species. Then he ended the transmission. Zythar sat in his command chair, feeling something strange in his chest. It took him a moment to recognize the feeling, because he had not experienced it in a very long time. It was uncertainty. Something about that human's eyes had disturbed him in a way he could not explain. 3 seconds later, alarms began screaming throughout his ship. Missiles were rising from the planet below. Not dozens of missiles. Not hundreds. Thousands of missiles were launching from hidden platforms all across Earth, and from secret bases on the moon, and from stations hidden in the asteroid belt. The humans had been preparing for this moment. They had been waiting for someone to come and threaten their world. They had been building weapons in secret for decades. Corzan shouted in panic as his screens filled with incoming fire. The first wave of missiles struck the Veltrathi fleet before they could raise their shields. 47 ships exploded in brilliant flashes of light. Their crews died without even understanding what was happening. Zythar watched in horror as more missiles kept coming. The humans were not begging for mercy. They were not surrendering. They were attacking a superior force with everything they had, and they showed no signs of stopping. In that moment, Ambassador Zythar began to understand that he had made a terrible mistake. He had studied human television and music and thought he understood them. But he had never looked at their history books. He had never learned about the wars they fought against impossible odds. He had never understood that humans did not know how to surrender. And now it was too late to learn. The battle had begun, and the Veltrathi were losing. Admiral Lisa Hartwell had waited her entire career for this day. She was 53 years old, with gray hair cut short and eyes the color of storm clouds. She had served in the United Earth Defense Command for 30 years and had trained for a war that most people did not even know was possible. Now she stood on the bridge of the USS Defiance, humanity's first true battleship, and watched the Veltrathi fleet burn. The Defiance was not like any ship that had come before it. It was massive and black, and covered in weapons that the public had never seen. It had been built in secret inside a hollowed-out asteroid, along with 47 other ships just like it. The governments of Earth had been preparing for alien contact since the first radio signals were detected 50 years ago. They knew that whoever came to visit would probably not be friendly. They had been right. Commander Nathan Cole stood beside her, reading data from his console. He was younger than Lisa, with dark skin and calm eyes. He reported that the initial missile strikes had destroyed 47 enemy vessels before they could activate their shields. The remaining Veltrathi ships were regrouping in high orbit. They were charging their weapons and preparing to counterattack. Lisa nodded and asked if the enemy had fired yet. Nathan checked his screens and said that they had not. The Veltrathi seemed to be waiting, perhaps trying to understand what had just happened to them. Lisa smiled. She wanted them to fire first. She wanted it recorded for all of history that the Veltrathi had attacked a defended planet and that humanity had simply responded. She told Nathan to wait. She told him to let them make the next move. The wait was not long. The Veltrathi commander, whoever had replaced the ambassador, gave the order to fire. Plasma cannons on 300 ships lit up at once and sent burning death toward Earth. The shots struck the upper atmosphere and turned the sky red. Cities trembled as the shockwaves passed overhead. People looked up and saw the heavens on fire, but the shots did not reach the ground. Hidden shield generators activated across the planet and caught the incoming fire. The shields had been built in secret by every nation working together. They had been tested 1,000 times but never used. Now they held against the most powerful weapons the galaxy had ever seen, and they did not break. Lisa watched the attack fail and felt satisfaction fill her chest. She turned to her communications officer, a young woman named Megan Price with red hair and freckles across her nose. Lisa told her to broadcast a message to all Earth Defense Forces. Authorization code, Omega. They were at war. Across the solar system, humanity answered the call. Hidden bases on Mars powered up their weapons. Defense platforms in the asteroid belt came online. Shipyards on the moon launched vessels that had been waiting for this moment. 17 nations that had been secretly cooperating for decades revealed their true strength to the universe. Lisa gave the order to return fire. She told her crew to show the Veltrathi what humans could do. The battle that followed lasted 6 hours. It was the most one-sided defeat in Veltrathi history. Human weapons tore through enemy shields like they were made of paper. Human pilots flew with a recklessness that the Veltrathi could not understand or counter. Human tactics changed constantly, adapting to every move the enemy made, never giving them a moment to recover. The Veltrathi were used to enemies who fought with honor and predictable patterns. Humans fought with no rules at all. They rammed ships into enemy formations. They sent soldiers in small pods to board enemy vessels and fight hand-to-hand in the corridors. They used every trick and deception they could think of because winning was the only thing that mattered. When the battle ended, 283 Veltrathi ships were nothing but debris floating in orbit. The survivors had surrendered or fled into hyperspace. Ambassador Zythar himself had been captured by human marines who boarded his flagship and fought their way to his command deck. Lisa watched as they brought the ambassador aboard the Defiance in chains. His scales had lost their shine and his 6 eyes were wide with an emotion she recognized immediately. It was fear. Pure and absolute fear. He had never experienced it before in his long life, but he was experiencing it now. She walked to the brig where they were holding him and stood outside his cell. He looked at her through the force field that kept him contained. He told her that what had happened was impossible. His voice was shaking. He said that humans were primitives. They should have surrendered. Every other species had surrendered. Why had they fought back? Lisa studied him for a long moment before answering. She told him that he had studied human signals for years. He had watched their television shows and their movies. He had listened to their music and observed their sports. He thought he understood what humans were. But he had missed everything that mattered. She stepped closer to the force field. She told him that he had never read human history books. He had never learned about the battles where humans fought against impossible odds and refused to retreat. He had never heard of Thermopylae, where 300 soldiers held back an army of hundreds of thousands. He had never learned about Stalingrad, where millions died in frozen streets rather than surrender a single city. He had never understood that humans do not give up. They do not submit, and when someone threatens their home, they do not stop fighting until the threat no longer exists. Zythar stared at her with all 6 of his eyes. He asked what would happen now. Lisa turned to walk away. She told him that a message drone would be sent to whatever council he answered to. The message would be simple. Humanity was coming. They were going to take the war to the Veltrathi homeworld. They were going to burn the empire to the ground. She paused at the door and looked back at him one more time. She told him to enjoy his cell. It was the safest place he would ever be again. Then she left to prepare her fleet for the long journey ahead. The first battle was over. The war had just begun. 6 months had passed since the Veltrathi came to Earth and found something they never expected. In that time, humanity had done what should have taken decades. They had studied the captured enemy ships. They had learned how their engines worked. They had built their own versions and made them even better. Now the first human fleet capable of traveling between stars was ready to carry the war to the enemy. Admiral Kevin Park stood on the bridge of the USS Horizon and looked at the stars through the main view screen. He was 60 years old with a weathered face and hands that had seen too many battles. He had commanded naval vessels on Earth's oceans for most of his life. Now he commanded a fleet of 200 warships flying through the void between stars. The universe had gotten much larger very quickly. Dr. Claire Bennett worked at a console behind him, studying data from captured Veltrathi computers. She was 38 years old with glasses and dark hair that she kept tied back in a practical bun. She had been a xenobiologist before the war, studying the possibility of alien life. Now she studied the aliens themselves, and what she found troubled her deeply. She called the admiral over and showed him what she had discovered. The Veltrathi did not simply conquer other species. They changed them. They took the fire out of their souls over generations. They bred the fight out of them until nothing remained but obedient servants. Hundreds of species had been processed this way across 12,000 years. Not one had ever escaped. Not one had ever fought back successfully. Kevin studied the data with hard eyes. He asked Claire if she believed the Veltrathi could do the same to humanity. Claire shook her head. She said it would take centuries, and humans would never stop resisting. But that was not what worried her. What worried her was all the other species out there who had already been broken. Billions of beings across hundreds of worlds who had forgotten how to fight. They were still out there, waiting for someone to remind them. Kevin understood what she was saying. This war was not just about saving Earth. It was about saving everyone. The fleet dropped out of hyperspace above a world called Kethos. It was the third colony of the Veltrothi home system. A green planet. With 2 billion inhabitants, the local defense fleet moved to intercept them. 300 ships arranged in perfect formation. They broadcast demands for surrender. They threatened destruction. They were confident in their power. They had no idea what was coming. Kevin gave the order to attack, but not in any way the Veltrothi expected. Half of his fleet engaged the enemy directly, while the other half swung around the planet to attack from behind. Small ships darted through the battle, jamming enemy sensors and communications. Unmanned vessels loaded with explosives flew straight into enemy formations and detonated. Marines in boarding pods latched onto enemy ships and cut their way inside. The Veltrothi fought with precision and discipline. Their formations were perfect, their tactics were sound. And none of it mattered because humans did not fight fair. The battle lasted 4 hours. When it was over, the Veltrothi fleet was shattered, and Kethos belonged to humanity. Commander Marcus Webb led the ground forces that landed on the planet's surface. He was 42 years old with a shaved head and scars on his arms from battles fought long ago on Earth. He had been a Marine for 20 years and thought he had seen everything war could offer. He was wrong. What he found on Kethos changed him forever. The planet was not just home to Veltrothi colonizers. It was also home to members of a dozen other species who had been conquered and integrated over the centuries. They walked the streets with empty eyes and bowed heads. They did not speak unless spoken to. They had forgotten their own languages and their own cultures. They had forgotten how to be themselves. Marcus gathered them in the central square of the capital city. Thousands of beings from races he had never seen before stared at him with confusion and fear. They expected punishment. They expected orders. They did not expect what came next. Marcus told them that the war was over for Kethos. He told them that humanity had not come to conquer them. Humanity had come to free them. He told them that they were no longer servants of the Veltrothi Empire. They were free to choose their own path. They could go home to worlds they had been taken from generations ago. They could stay and build new lives. They could even join the fight if they wanted to remember what it meant to be warriors. The silence that followed was heavy. These beings had never heard such words. Freedom was a concept that had been erased from their minds long ago. They did not know what to do with it. Then a single figure stepped forward from the crowd. It was an old female from a species called the Corvani. She had 4 arms and skin the color of copper. She had been born on this world and had never known anything but service. But somewhere deep inside her, a spark still remained. She asked if what the humans said was true. She asked if they could really be free. Marcus knelt down so that his eyes were level with hers. He told her that humanity had fought against tyranny for its entire existence. They had fought kings and emperors and dictators. They had fought anyone who tried to take their freedom away. And now they would fight for her freedom too, because that was what humans did. They fought for each other. They fought for what was right. The old Corvani female looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something that no one expected. She laughed. It was a rusty sound, like a machine that had not been used in years. But it was real, and it spread through the crowd like fire. Within a week, the first alien volunteers had enlisted in the Liberation Fleet. Within a month, their numbers had grown to hundreds of thousands. Word spread to other conquered worlds that the humans were coming. That freedom was coming. That hope was coming. The Empire had created slaves for 12,000 years. Now, those slaves were waking up. And they were angry. High Counselor Vithrak had ruled the Veltrothi Empire for 300 years. He had seen empires rise and fall across the galaxy. He had crushed rebellions and silenced dissent. He had built monuments to his own glory that stretched toward the stars. In all that time, he had never known fear. Now he sat on his throne in the Eternal Palace and felt something cold spreading through his chest. The throne room was vast and dark, filled with shadows and the weight of 12,000 years of history. No enemy had ever set foot in this place. No voice had ever been raised against the High Counselor within these walls. It was the heart of the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known, and it was about to fall. The messenger who stood before him was a young diplomat named Sazthar. His scales were pale with terror, and his voice shook as he delivered his report. 17 colony worlds had fallen to the humans in the past 3 months. The Liberation Fleet, as they called it, had grown from 200 ships to over 2,000. Former slave species were joining the fight in numbers that could not be counted. The Veltrathi military was in retreat on every front. Vithrak listened in silence. When Sazthar finished speaking, the High Counselor asked him to explain how this was possible. The Veltrathi had the largest fleet in the galaxy. They had weapons that could crack planets in half. They had never lost a war in 12,000 years. How could a species that had barely reached their own moon be defeating them? Sazthar did not have an answer. No one did. Vithrak dismissed the messenger and sat alone in the darkness of his throne room. He thought about the reports he had received from the front lines. They told stories that he could barely believe. Human soldiers fought with a ferocity that made Veltrathi warriors look timid. They did not retreat even when they were outnumbered 10-1. They laughed in the face of death and sang songs as they charged into battle. They treated war like an art form that they had spent their entire existence perfecting. One report haunted him above all others. A Veltrathi commander had captured a wounded human soldier and demanded to know why the humans kept fighting. Peace had been offered. Surrender had been offered. Integration into the empire would have been painless. Why did they resist when resistance was hopeless? The human had smiled with blood on his teeth. He told the commander that peace was not what the Veltrathi wanted. The Veltrathi wanted submission. They wanted obedience. They wanted to erase everything that made humans who they were. And humans would never accept that. They would rather burn the entire galaxy to ash than kneel to anyone. Then the human had pressed a hidden button on his belt. The explosive he had been carrying killed him instantly. It also killed the Veltrathi commander and his entire staff. Vithrak had read that report a dozen times. Each time he understood a little more about what he was dealing with. The humans were not like other species. They did not value survival above all else. They valued freedom. They valued the right to choose their own path. And they were willing to die, willing to kill, willing to destroy everything in their way to protect those values. The Veltrathi had conquered 900 worlds by making other species fear death. But you cannot threaten someone who does not fear death. You cannot break someone who would rather die than bend. Vithrak rose from his throne and walked to the great window that overlooked the capital city. Millions of Veltrathi lived below him, going about their daily lives, unaware of how close the end had come. They trusted their High Counselor to protect them. They believed in the power of the eternal dominion. He would not let them down. Vithrak summoned his military commanders and gave them orders that had never been given before. The Grand Fleet would be assembled. Every warship from every corner of the empire would be called home. Every soldier, every weapon, every resource would be gathered for one final battle. They would crush the humans and make an example that would silence resistance for another 12,000 years. The commanders bowed and hurried to obey. Within days, warships began arriving above the homeworld, thousands of them, tens of thousands. The largest fleet ever assembled in the history of the galaxy. But even as the ships gathered, reports continued to arrive from the front lines. More worlds were falling. More species were joining the rebellion. The Liberation Fleet was coming closer every day, and nothing seemed to stop it. General Korthax, the supreme commander of the Veltrathi military, came to the throne room to deliver his assessment. He was old and scarred from 100 battles, but his voice was steady. He told the High Counselor that the Grand Fleet was ready. He told him that they outnumbered the enemy 3-1. He told him that victory was certain. Then he hesitated. Vithrak saw the hesitation and demanded to know what the general was not saying. Korthax lowered his eyes. He said that the numbers favored the Veltrathi. The weapons favored the Veltrathi. Logic and strategy favored the Veltrathi. But he had studied the humans carefully. He had watched recordings of their battles. He had read reports from survivors. The humans did not care about numbers or weapons or logic. They cared about winning. They would find a way to win even when it seemed impossible. They would sacrifice anything and everything to achieve victory. They were not like any enemy the Veltrathi had ever faced. Korthax told the High Counselor that he believed they could win this battle. But he was not certain. And in 12,000 years of conquest, uncertainty was something the Veltrathi had never experienced. Vithrak dismissed the general and sat alone once more. He thought about his empire, and his people, and his legacy. He thought about the humans who were coming to destroy everything he had built. He had wanted to make an example of Earth. He had wanted to show the galaxy what happened to those who resisted. Instead, Earth had made an example of him. They had shown the galaxy that the Veltrathi could be beaten. They had shown every conquered species that freedom was possible. And now those species were rising up. Now the empire was crumbling. Now the end was coming. Vithrak looked at the stars through his window and waited for the battle that would decide the fate of the galaxy. The final battle began on a cold morning above the Veltrathi homeworld. Admiral Lisa Hartwell stood on the bridge of the USS Defiance and looked at the enemy fleet that filled her view screen. There were so many ships that they blocked out the stars. The Grand Fleet of the Eternal Dominion, the largest military force ever assembled in the history of the galaxy, had come to defend its capital, and Lisa had come to destroy it. Her own fleet had grown beyond anything she could have imagined a year ago. 2,000 human warships flew beside her. Another 8,000 ships crewed by former slave species flew with them. The Liberation Fleet had become something more than an army. It had become a symbol of hope for every being who had ever been conquered by the Veltrathi. Commander Nathan Cole stood at her side as he had since the first battle above Earth. He was calm and steady as always. He reported that the enemy fleet outnumbered them 3-1. Their weapons were charged. Their formations were perfect. They were ready to fight. Lisa smiled. She had beaten perfect formations before. She would beat them again. She opened a channel to the entire fleet. Her voice carried across thousands of ships and reached the ears of millions of soldiers from dozens of species. She told them that this was the day they had been fighting for. This was the day they would end 12,000 years of tyranny. This was the day they would show the galaxy that freedom could never be crushed. She paused and looked at the stars that had been hidden by the enemy fleet. She told her soldiers to give them hell. The battle that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Ships clashed in formations that stretched across millions of kilometers. Weapons fire lit up the darkness like a storm of light and death. Thousands of vessels were destroyed in the first hour alone, their crews dying in the cold void of space. The Veltrathi fought with everything they had. Their commanders were skilled, and their soldiers were brave. But they fought the same way they had always fought. They followed the same tactics they had used for centuries. They expected the enemy to break and run when the pressure became too great. The Liberation Fleet did not break. They did not run. They adapted and changed, and found new ways to attack. Human commanders made decisions in seconds that would have taken Veltrathi officers hours to consider. Former slave soldiers fought with a fury born from generations of oppression. Every ship that fell was replaced by 2 more pushing forward. The battle raged for 3 days. Lisa did not sleep. She barely ate. She stood on the bridge of the Defiance and commanded her fleet through the largest conflict in galactic history. She watched friends die on view screens. She ordered attacks that sent thousands to their deaths. She made choices that would haunt her for the rest of her life. But she did not stop. She could not stop. Too many people were counting on her. On the 3rd day, the Veltrathi lines finally broke. The Grand Fleet, the pride of the Eternal Dominion, shattered and scattered. Some ships fled into hyperspace. Others surrendered. Most were destroyed, their debris forming a ring around the homeworld that would remain for centuries as a memorial to the cost of war. The Defiance descended through the atmosphere toward the capital city. Lisa led a squad of Marines through streets that had never known the footsteps of invaders. They met no resistance. The Veltrathi military had been destroyed. The civilian population hid in their homes and waited to see what would happen. Lisa walked through the doors of the Eternal Palace and into the throne room where High Counselor Vithrak sat alone. He was old and tired, and his scales had lost their shine. He did not rise when she entered. He did not speak. He simply watched her approach with eyes that had seen 300 years of power crumble to nothing in 12 months. Lisa stopped before the throne and looked at the being who had ordered the conquest of Earth. She remembered the day this had all started. She remembered the arrogance of Ambassador Zythar and his demands for surrender. She remembered telling him that humanity would never submit. She had been right. Vithrak spoke first. His voice was quiet and empty of emotion. He asked why. He said that the Veltrathi had offered peace. They had offered integration. Humans would have been given a place in the Empire. They would have been treated fairly. Why had they chosen war instead? Millions of humans had died in the fighting. Was it worth the cost? Lisa considered his question carefully. She thought about all the soldiers who had given their lives. She thought about the families who would never see their loved ones again. She thought about the price that humanity had paid for this victory. Then she answered him. She told him that he had never understood what he was dealing with. He had seen human entertainment and human conflicts, and thought he understood the species. But he had missed the thing that mattered most. He had missed the reason humans fought each other in the first place. Humans fought because they valued freedom above all else. They argued because they believed in truth. They struggled because they refused to accept injustice when they could fight against it. The very thing that made humans fight each other was the same thing that made them unstoppable when they united against a common enemy. The Veltrathi had built an empire on obedience. They had created a galaxy full of servants who did what they were told. Humanity had built a civilization on defiance. They had created a society where every person had the right to choose their own path. That was why the Veltrathi had lost. They had never understood that some things were worth dying for. Vithrak listened in silence. When she finished speaking, he asked what would happen to him and his people. Lisa told him that he would face justice. Every species that had been conquered by the Veltrathi would have a voice in deciding his fate. The empire he had built on slavery and oppression would be dismantled. The beings who had been subjugated for thousands of years would finally be free. She turned to leave the throne room. At the door, she paused and looked back at him one more time. She told him that this was the human way. They won together. They rebuilt together. They created a future where everyone had a chance to be free. "Welcome to the galaxy," she said. "Humanity is here to stay." 1 year later, the Galactic Liberation Council held its first meeting on Earth. Representatives from 200 species gathered to build a new future based on cooperation instead of conquest. Captain Daniel Morrison, the first human to speak with the Veltrathi, served as Earth's ambassador. He opened the session with words that would be remembered for generations. He said that humanity had entered the galaxy as unknowns. They had been seen as primitives and prey, and subjects to be conquered. The galaxy had learned the truth the hard way. Humanity was not the deadliest species because they were the strongest or the smartest. They were the deadliest because they never gave up. He raised his coffee mug in a toast to the representatives of 200 worlds. "Now let us build something worth fighting for," he said. And they did.